Good evening, everybody. I'm the moderator of the scientific part of the program tonight. I'm Gerhard Gründer. I'm a psychiatrist at the Central Institute of Mental Health in Mannheim, and together with Andrea Jungaberle here, co-director of the Ovid Clinic here just next door. So tonight it's my pleasure to introduce Professor David Nutt, and his accomplishments are so huge I had to take notes. I usually never take notes for anything. So, Professor Nutt is and please interrupt me if something is wrong. It's on your website. Professor Nutt is Edmund Safran Professor of Neuropsychopharmacology and Director of the Neuropsychopharmacology Unit in the Division of Brain Sciences at Imperial College London. After completing his psychiatry training in Oxford, he spent 2 years as chief of the section of clinical science in the National Institute of Alcohol Abuse and Alcoholism, NIAAA, in Bethesda, USA, and after returning to England in 1988, he set up a research group, the Psychopharmacology Unit at Bristol University, and he repeated the same 20 years later when he moved to the Imperial College London in 2008. Besides of what is listed here, Imperial College London, his position there, he is currently chair of drug science, and previously he was president of the European Brain Council, the European College of Neuropsychopharmacology, ECNP, the British Neuroscience Association, and the British Association of Psychopharmacology, and I think many others. He's member of many scientific societies. He was editor of the Journal of Psychopharmacology for more than 20 years, and some of us published papers in his journal. And I just checked an hour ago in PubMed, he has almost 1,000 publications in PubMed. I think 999 something. He has published more than 40 books. And remarkably, he is a senior author of 2 of very influential papers published by Robin Carter-Harris, 2016 in Lancet Psychiatry, the first trial in treatment-resistant depression, and then in 2021, the New England Journal paper, the comparison of psilocybin with escitalopram. So there would be many more things to say, but the floor should be yours now. We are happy to have you here, David. Thank you for coming to Berlin.
Well, thank you very much. It's a pleasure and delight to be amongst friends and people with similar vision. As you mentioned, I've done quite a lot of things and published quite a lot, even in the field of psychedelics, which I've been working in now for almost 20 years. But I've only got half an hour. So if you want to learn more, you've got to read the book. Where's the book? And I thought I'd focus on a topic that I think is particularly important, at this stage, because the evolution of psychedelic therapy isn't perhaps going as easily and as cleanly as we would have hoped. And there are some misunderstandings and maybe some deliberate misrepresentations of the way in which psychedelic therapy could or should or must be delivered. And I wanted to really touch on what I think is perhaps the most critical issue, which is the fundamental difference between psychedelic therapy and, for tonight, antidepressant therapy for depression. The same would apply for other disorders like addiction, but we haven't got time to go into those. And I want to sort of set the scene for what is going to be, I think, a huge battle over the next 10 years. But some of you will probably know that, there are people who believe, well, certainly there are people who've invested in companies that tell them they're going to cure depression with non-psychedelic psychedelics, which I think is a kind of oxymoron, and also unproven, and also almost irrelevant. But they're commandeering a lot of the airspace, and they're doing it with, I think, almost manipulating some of the ways in which people understand science and brain science. So I'm going to focus a lot on science in this talk, just so you know where I think we are in terms of the real underpinning science. And the conclusion I'm going to come to at the end won't surprise you, is I think there are fundamental differences in the way psychedelics work compared with other antidepressant treatments, and I think that's going to be relevant to how psychedelic therapy goes forward, if it goes forward, because I think if it doesn't go forward as a different therapy, then it's dead. And historically, of course, some drug therapies did die. I know Freud wasn't German, but he did speak German, and some of you may know that he started off like me as a psychopharmacologist. His first experiments were on cocaine, so were mine, interestingly. I was using cocaine to try to, as an alternative antidepressant. I was trying to model depression, to try to treat depression with cocaine in animal models. It didn't work. It didn't work for Freud. He moved to opium, that didn't work either. And then he gave up, and then he started to invent talking therapies. But he was always open-minded to the concept that the future may teach us how to exercise by a direct influence, by means upon a particular chemical substances upon the neural apparatus, the brain. It may be that there are still other undreamt of possibilities of therapy. Now, actually, maybe if he hadn't been living in Vienna, if he'd been in Paris, he'd have understood mescaline was around. But never mind, he didn't, and he went on to develop psychoanalysis. So we're going to be talking about psychopharmacology, comparing different kinds of drugs. So it's important that you understand just the very simple concept that I'm going to be working with. So the brain is made up of neurons, you all know that, and they talk to each other through synapses, chemicals are released, and we're going to be focusing on a chemical called serotonin. Serotonin is packaged in little vesicles in serotonin-containing neurons. The vesicles are released, serotonin moves across the synapse and sits on postsynaptic receptors, the other side of the synapse, postsynaptic receptors. Now, antidepressants, most antidepressants are serotonergic antidepressants, and they work by enhancing the amount of serotonin in the synapse by blocking these uptake sites, reuptake sites. And normally the serotonin goes back into the presynaptic axon through an uptake site. And antidepressants, like SSRIs, block that, and they make more serotonin available. And that means the serotonin can act on a number of postsynaptic receptors. And in different parts of the brain, there are different receptors. In fact, there are 14 different serotonin receptors in the brain, and they do very different things depending on where they are in the brain. Psychedelics, psilocybin, LSD, work on postsynaptic receptors of one particular sort. You all know that, the serotonin 5-HT receptor. So we have increasing serotonin, and we have directly stimulating receptors. There's two separate ways in which we can produce changes in the brain which are relevant to depression. Now, the 5-HT2A receptor is intriguing because obviously it is the receptor that psychedelics work on. But the question is, and this is still an unresolved question, is why are they there? Now, some people think they're there so we can get benefits from mushrooms. But most neuroscientists think, well, maybe there's another explanation, or maybe there are more than one explanation. What's really fascinating about these receptors is their distribution. So, on the left-hand side, you have the distribution of these receptors labeled with this compound, CB36, which is a compound that my group and Peter Knudsen's group in Copenhagen Spent 15 years developing. It's a psychedelic, and that's particularly relevant because it binds to the active form of the 5-HT2A receptor. But we use it as a PET tracer. We label it with carbon-11. It goes into the living human brain, and it binds to where there are serotonin 2A receptors. And you see, this is the human brain, this is the front, this is the back, here's the midbrain, here's the spinal cord. Color coding, red is more and blue is less. So the first thing you notice is there's very little psychedelic binding in the midbrain and brainstem. And that explains why these drugs are very, very safe. They don't affect respiration. They have very little impact on cardiovascular function after the first few minutes of giving them. They largely bind to cortical regions. And these cortical regions, remarkably, are the cortical regions that have most recently evolved. So on the right-hand side, this is an evolutionary map of the brain. Red, the darker the red, the more recently that bit of the brain has evolved. And there's a peculiar parallelity between where the 2A receptors are and where the brain has recently evolved. And these red chunks of the brain here, the newly evolved parts of the brain, we call transmodal cortices. And transmodal means that they integrate brain function. And those newly evolved parts of the brain are the reason why you are much cleverer than any other primate. Because you've got a large chunk of new brain that can do things that other primate brains can't do, which is a lot of thinking and feeling and understanding and analysis, reflection, creation, etc. Creativity. Now, we don't know whether this massive expansion of the brain is got anything to do with these receptors. We do know that the human brain has more of these receptors than any other brain. Some people believe that, you've probably heard of the stoned ape theory, some people believe, the Kenners believe, perhaps, that the early hominids, when they started eating mushrooms, started to get insights which led them to become more skilled at doing things, and gradually they're stimulating their brain through mushrooms led to the massive expansion of the human brain, which is one of the, arguably, the biggest, most rapid evolutionary change that's ever been known. Because it's less than a million years, our brain has gone from, it's doubled in size through this massive increase in these transmodal regions. But what's for sure is that psychedelics work in these regions and produce changes in these regions, and that really is where we should be looking to understand the psychedelic experience and the benefits of it. We published a paper earlier this year arguing perhaps that these receptors do help make the human brain the most, the efficient phenomenon, the efficient machine, computer that it is. And maybe I'll give you an analogy which maybe it helps. Why are these receptors there? Well, one explanation, one theory would be that when you have a great insight into something, these receptors pull together the network of brain neurons, which will potentially download and encode that great insight. So see if you think this is a reasonable explanation. So the first caveman that worked out that rubbing sticks together produced fire. That effort of rubbing sticks together probably wasn't driven by any attempt to make fire. But the insight, when he realized that rubbing sticks together could make fire, the insight that then made fire available everywhere, that insight would have been laid down by the effect of the communications driven by these receptors, because we know they're on the neurons which control cross-cortical activity. So pulling together of a massive insight into the value of something is likely driven by neurons which have these receptors. So that may be why they exist at all. Now, one thing is very certain, that if you give humans psychedelics, connectivity in their brain changes dramatically. This has become almost a meme now for what psychedelics do. It's an image that came out of a biomathematics group in King's College, the Professor Experts group,
Now, each side of those circles has the same number of connections, 7,200 connections. And the connections are statistical connections. The likelihood of a particular voxel in the brain, where we can measure activity, the likelihood of that particular little cube of brain changing activity in relation to how others do. And it's obvious there's a huge difference between the two. This is the psychedelic state, and this is the normal state. And the normal state is called the small world brain state. And the state this has become understood in the last 20 years or so as explaining why the human brain is so brilliantly efficient at computing. So your brains are 10 times more efficient in terms of energy costs per unit of information processed than the best human computers. And the reason for that is that your brains do most of the computing very locally. So the visual cortex talks to the visual cortex, the auditory cortex, the auditory cortex. Because if you hear a bus bearing down on you, you've got to move your legs and you've got to get your motor cortex moving. Well, but the efficiency of the human brain is driven by the fact that it doesn't spend a lot of energy communicating across that enormous amount of space, which is your transmotor cortex. And that's fantastic. So I guess almost none of you are English speakers, native English speakers, but you all know every word I have said, you have understood the meaning of every word I've said. Your brain is phenomenally powerful at encoding facts like that. The problem is, sometimes wrong facts get encoded. And that is very relevant to disorders like depression. The process of encoding is a process which we have begun to consider as canalization. You essentially, it's a bit like cutting a disc. You cut a memory, and the more you rehearse that memory, the deeper and deeper the cut. And depression, it can be envisaged or conceptualized as a disorder in which the thinking, the negative thinking of depression, the thoughts of guilt and despair and unsatisfactoriness, etc., become ruminations, and those ruminations dig deeper and deeper. The thinking then gets into this deeply depressed state. The depression is called depression because you're in a depression. It's a topographic term before it became a psychological term. So how can you get someone out of this deep rut? And the answer, I think, is to disrupt the processes which canalize the brain. And psychedelics are the only drugs we know to do that. So under psychedelics, your brain is put back to a state where it was before you did any canalization, when you were a child. And one of the theories of education is you take a brain where everything's possible, all connections are there, and you drive it to this brain, which is much, much more efficient, doing all the things that your parents and your school teachers, etc., tell you to do, but at the potential cost of having unwanted, deeply ingrained beliefs like worthlessness in depression or the need to wash your hands if you've got OCD, etc. I just wanted to show, I've got to show this picture because this is one of the most beautiful pictures we've produced. This is the first ever human study of LSD in the brain. And it's a particularly scientific study for those who know about a bit about the brain, because we actually plotted out in our volunteers the visual cortex. This is called V1, where the primary inputs from your eyes go to allow you to see. And in the small world brain, the visual cortex V1 talks to V2 and talks a little bit to other visual cortices and a little bit to hippocampus for memory. This is the efficient way of using your brain to see things. And that's all you're doing now. Everything you see is largely being processed in this very local region. But under LSD, people have profound and interesting and complex visual hallucinations, often with synesthesia. And that's because the visual cortex V1 is connected to everywhere. And those insights, that increased connectivity doesn't just lead to increased visual experiences, it also leads to very different ways of thinking. you see profound perturbations of the transmedial cortex, allowing people to think differently. And that thinking differently is obviously critical to overcome something like depression. And one discovery we made, which was completely unexpected, and I should say at the outset, when we started doing this, I started working with Dr. Gerhard Gründer when he came to be a PhD student of mine about 20 plus years ago. And we were really asking a very simple question: what is the nature of the psychedelic state? And we showed you from the previous image the nature of the psychedelic state is increased connectivity. We didn't expect to be moving into therapy at all. But there was one particular analysis we did, which is this one here, which got us thinking that maybe there could be therapeutic utility. And this is the impact of psychedelics on the network, or the default mode network. How many of you know about the default mode network? So, kind of most of you. Well, I'll just explain it for those who don't fully know. The default mode network is a network which is frontal, posterior, singular, and these two parietal regions of the brain. And it's called the default mode because it's the area of the brain, or the network, which is active when you are not doing anything other than thinking. So when you're lying quietly in bed, when you go home tonight and you lie back and think, was it worth standing up in the back of a hall that's full of hot, sweaty bodies? Was it actually worth it to hear this guy Nutt speak? And the answer is yes, of course. When you're doing nothing but thinking, this is the network which is active. Which is why it's called the default network. As soon as you open your eyes or listen or start moving your arms and legs, this switches off and the other networks become active. Now what's remarkable, and you can see from the lower image, is that psilocybin and other psychedelics completely disrupt the default mode network. And that explains why people often disappear, they come out the scanner, they often go into other dimensions, or they go to heaven, or do other things, because your sense of where you are in the world is defined by the default mode network. And if you disturb it like that, your sense of self, your ego dissolves. Okay, well, that's interesting, that's a psychedelic state. What's that got to do with depression? Well, almost simultaneously with our publishing that data, this group from Yale published these data. And it looks at the default mode network in people with major depressive disorder and compares it with healthy controls. This is the default mode network I showed you before, anterior, posterior, retrofoil. In people with depression, a lot more of the brain is engaged in the default mode network. And that explains several things. Why depressed people struggle with executive tasks. Well, they can't read a book or sustain watching a film, or can't even go to work because they can't add up or do the executive tasks, because so much of their brain is engaged in this self-referential depressive thinking, which is often rumination. And in fact, there's a strong correlation between the hyperconnectivity of the default mode and rumination. So we thought, wow, depression is a disorder of too much default mode. We can get rid of the default mode. What happens? So we did the study. We gave people with depression psilocybin. And we did it in this fashion now, which is, I suppose, a pretty standard way of doing it, which is essentially a 3-day process following eligibility, determination of people that are on medicine, that are going to interfere, that they don't have a history of psychosis, etc. They come into the unit, or come near to the unit. They don't stay overnight, they don't stay in the hospital for 3 nights, but they have 2 nights near us. Because the first day there's a preparation and a session of essentially working with them so that they gain the best impact, or the best outcome from the psychedelic treatment. And that involves dealing with issues like fear and anxiety and encouraging them to go with the experiences. And then there's a dosing day. This is the room we've mocked up to give them a sense of relaxation and being close to nature. In the dosing day, they don't get psychotherapy. They're encouraged to have a sound system, sound tracks. They have eye shades and then encouraged to go wherever their mind takes them under the psilocybin. And then the next day, they have what we call integration sessions. It's very similar to what you guys do here. And then if you can afford it, you give them support for a few more days afterwards, depending on how much resources we've got for the study. So it's a pretty standard way of doing psychedelic therapy. And we always use a 25 milligram dose of psilocybin, which produces reliably. So this was the paper that was mentioned at the beginning, the Lancet Psychiatry paper. So these are people that all failed on 2 antidepressants, so they were on 10, they all failed on CBT. And you can see that there's a profound reduction in depression scores. We use, in this case, this is the quiz, the self-report scale. A halving of depression scores which persisted for months. So that's the most powerful single intervention in treatment-resistant depression ever recorded. And it's spawned companies like Compass Pathways and other companies working with other psychedelics to try to do the same. And they have already replicated some of these things. So it's powerful and it's fast. But what are the mechanisms? Well, I obviously talked about the disruption of the default mode network, but could other antidepressants do the same? Is it different from other antidepressants, or is it just a pretty more powerful way of doing what other treatments do? I just wanted to say one other thing about the value of this, and this is important because I know that you guys here are setting up to do a massive phase 3 trial of psilocybin in depression, and I'm not entirely sure that that's the most efficient way of asking the question as to whether psilocybin is a good treatment. Read this paper, which we published to honour a very, very famous clinical pharmacologist, Michael Rawlings, the man who used to run the MHRA in Britain, with the FDA. And he argued we should be using more modern designs, more cost-effective designs, and Bayesian analysis to essentially improve on our CTs. And after he died, we did a Bayesian analysis of those data that I showed you, the Lancet Psychiatry data. And it's published there. And you can see that even if you are skeptical about the effect, the next patient who goes into a trial like this has got an 80% chance of recovery. And that is very, very powerful as a predictor. So this kind of approach might be a more efficient way of looking at the value of psychedelics than doing RCTs. However, let's get to the main core of what this talks about, which is, does psilocybin work differently to SSRIs? Obviously, pharmacologically they're different, but what about the impact on depression? So this is the New England Journal paper that you mentioned. It was a trial that was designed to look at brain mechanisms. It wasn't powered to show differences in efficacy. We couldn't afford to do that. You need probably 50 or more people in each arm to look at efficacy differences because of the variability of these trials. It was powered to look at the brain and to look at side effects, but also to compare efficacy as a secondary endpoint. It took us about 6 months to work out the optimal design, and I think this is probably the best we could do. We reasoned that psychedelics were at that time undergoing the beginning of quite a lot of hype, and people would want to have a psychedelic experience or to be exposed to a psychedelic, to psilocybin, coming into the trial. And that was necessary. It was necessary to get what we call clinical equipoise, that both arms of the trial had a realistic chance of producing a good outcome. So what we did was we gave everyone psilocybin on 2 occasions. At the beginning, at baseline, the first dosing day, and 3 weeks later, the second dosing. But half the group got a 25 milligram dose, a trip dose, and half the group got a 1 milligram dose, a non-trip dose. The ones who didn't get trips went on to escitalopram for 6 weeks. The ones that got a trip went into placebo for 6 weeks. But everyone got the full range of preparation, support during the experience, and also the integration afterwards. So we, as far as possible, balanced out the psychotherapy on both of those sessions. And we did brain imaging before. So here are the data. On the left-hand side is the standard way of presenting clinical outcomes. You take a baseline, which is high, people have depression scores that are high, and you look at the change. And you can see the red line is psilocybin, the blue line is escitalopram. Escitalopram works rather well. If you give escitalopram plus essentially 3 days of psychotherapy before you start it, there's a big effect. And the effect persists. Escitalopram is an antidepressant. It's not such for that. Psilocybin works quickly as well, as we would predicted, and tends to outperform escitalopram across the whole time. Remarkably, and we don't fully understand quite why there's such a huge difference, these are just mean changes in the QIDS score, which is turns out to not to be a very good measure. We've now realised that QIDS is definitely not the scale to use for future studies. But if we look at other self-rating scales like the BEC, or if we look at the HAM-D and the Madras, the doctor rating scales, and we look at remission rates, the percentage of patients who are getting to a state where they don't have depression, remission rates are much higher on psilocybin than on escitalopram. It varies enormously depending on what scale you use, but it's at least twice as good. Psilocybin at least twice as good as getting people into remission. Now, why might that be? Well, one explanation for that is this, is that as well as reducing depression, psilocybin improves well-being. This is the Warwick Edinburgh Mental Wellbeing Score, and you can see this profound improvement in well-being that we measure 2 weeks after psilocybin. It almost certainly comes on sooner, maybe increased by the second dose of psilocybin. Escitalopram improves well-being, but not as much. And the reasons for that I'll come on to in a minute. And also, psilocybin had better tolerability, it had improved sleep, it had better improvements in gut measures as well. So here's a summary of all the measures we took. Green tells you that this particular variable is significantly better on psilocybin patients than on escitalopram patients. In fact, the only measure that wasn't better for psilocybin was the QIDS measure, which we used at the beginning, which we now regret using because we realise the scale is a complicated scale that patients often don't understand because it has some of the questions are in the opposite direction to the others and people get mixed up. But on all the other measures, the patient-rated measures, the BEC, the doctor-rated measures, the work and social functioning, anhedonia, all these different measures, psilocybin was significantly better than escitalopram. Now, I started off by talking about rumination being one of the key features of canalization, the thinking becoming very deeply entrenched. So we looked at that. We looked at 2 aspects of that. The rumination scores and the ability to stop rumination, thought suppression scores, in the 2 groups. So psilocybin are red and escitalopram are blue. Okay? And the dark ones are before, and the light ones are 6 weeks after. And what you see is before, the 2 groups were pretty much the same in terms of rumination and in terms of the ability to stop having negative thoughts. But after psilocybin, a significant proportion of the patients were able to stop ruminating and stop having, essentially block or stop or change their negative thoughts through thought suppression. So this is a clear difference between these 2 agents. And that was relevant because it turned out that here you see the non-responders versus responders. You see the responders to psilocybin had profoundly better ability, profoundly less rumination, and a better ability to suppress these negative thoughts than the non-responders. Whereas with escitalopram, there was no change. So that touches on one important feature of psychedelics. Psychedelics change your ability, they improve your ability to think differently, whereas escitalopram doesn't. And intriguing, the imaging data confirm that there may be a biological basis for this, because what we have here are data measuring the ability of the brain to change its state. So when you're imaging brain function under fMRI, you can measure a series of different states, and you can look at the speed at which the brain changes between these different states. And the measure that is used to look at the lack of flexibility of the brain is called modularity. So modularity is, you can hear the modularity of the different subjects' brains here. And then after psilocybin, overall, there was a reduction in modularity. Brains became more flexible, they changed more readily. And that increased flexibility correlated with improvements in depression scores at 6 months. And also improvements in connectivity between networks, particularly the executive network, the network of thinking and doing executive tasks, like planning and remembering, which was impaired in depression. That network became better connected following psilocybin. Escitalopram didn't change modularity, no more flexible, no relationship with outcome, no improvement in executive function. So I think reasonable evidence that psilocybin is producing changes in depression through a different mechanism to escitalopram. So how is escitalopram working? Well, the prediction by us and by loads of other groups before we did this study was that escitalopram is working to suppress stress centers in the brain. And the evidence that has been accumulated now over about 20 years relies on the activation of this brain region called the amygdala. This is a subcortical, subconscious stress center in the brain. You can measure the activity in this using MRI scanners. And if you're in a scanner and you show someone a fearful face, the amygdala becomes activated. And that's because the amygdala is always scanning the world for reasons to be frightened. And in fact, you will start, if someone's looking frightened, you will begin to be frightened before you even know subjectively that they are frightened. They look frightened and you are frightened. This is a very primitive but powerful reflex. And so we ask the question, well, what happens to the amygdala activity before and after psilocybin compared with before and after escitalopram? But we did something else. We weren't just interested in fearful faces and fear threats. We wanted to know whether there were changes in responses to happy faces and neutral faces, which are also sensitive. The amygdala is also sensitive to those. And there's a huge, huge literature. This is a meta-analysis of brain imaging studies, which shows that SSRIs suppress the amygdala fear response. And people like Kaplan and Oxford have developed a whole theory of how antidepressants work to suppress fear and allow people then to engage in more rewarding activities, like just living a life, because the fear suppression center is massively attenuated. So we compared the impact of fearful faces, happy faces, and neutral faces in the two groups. And the key data down here, well, the first thing to say is there were significant differences between the two groups in terms of brain activity. Psilocybin, there was more activity when people were looking at faces under psilocybin than escitalopram. And if we look at, and that's here, if we look at the specific faces, look at fearful faces here, escitalopram significantly attenuated the amygdala response to fearful faces, which is exactly what the literature tells us it should do. It also attenuated activity to happy faces, and also to neutral faces, whereas psilocybin effectively did nothing. You might have even made neutral faces look a bit happier. Now, so that is very reassuring. In our patients, escitalopram did what it does in everyone else's patients. This has just been accepted in the American Journal of Psychiatry. But it tells us something really important. It tells us there are two ways to live depression. The traditional way, the escitalopram way, is to increase serotonin in the synapses, in the amygdala and the limbic system. This increased serotonin works for one of those 14 receptors, called the 5-HT1A receptor. That's an inhibitory receptor. It dampens down amygdala activity. That protects the limbic system from stress. It also reduces anxiety and impulsivity, which are sometimes useful things to have as well. But the price of that is emotional blunting, which was exemplified by the fact that the escitalopram group had blunted responses to the happy faces. And we know from 20 years of talking to patients that SSRIs, they do numb stress, but they also numb pleasure. They shrink the repertoire, the emotional repertoire. And for some people, that's very disturbing. Psilocybin works in a different way. It works in the cortex on a different receptor, the 2A receptor, produces this profound stimulation of the neurons, which changes, in the way I showed you, the connectivity of the brain, breaks down perseverative thinking, leads to cognitive flexibility, and also changes in people's ability to connect with nature and with themselves, and massively increase well-being. So to us, that's really pleasing, because now we can say we have two ways to help people overcome depression. So depression is on the same par as things like hypertension or cancer, where if one treatment doesn't work, you've got another treatment. And I just want to give you this wonderful quote from one patient who had both treatments. He was in the escitalopram arm, and then he went off and did psilocybin in a different place and came back and told us. And he said this: where escitalopram nulled me to be less scared, psilocybin has made me realize that fear is not something to be feared. And that really does encapsulate the fundamental difference. I'll just give you one analogy that I use quite a lot to explain how SSRIs work. And it's the analogy of a broken bone. You break a bone, you set the bone in plaster. The plaster doesn't heal the bone. What the plaster does is allow the bone to heal itself by making sure that it doesn't get stressed and displaced, etc. And that's what SSRIs do. SSRIs allow the brain to heal by dampening down the supersensitive stress response that occurs in depression. And that's why they take weeks to work, because the brain has to recover from that chronic stress. Whereas psychedelics work in a different part of the brain and disrupt the thinking, which augments, underpins, and may even drive some of the stress response. So here's our current model of what's going on with psychedelic therapy. And it applies both to disorders like depression or addiction. In the state of depression or addiction, the energy landscape of the brain is very extreme. I like to use the analogy, it's like Switzerland. You can be in a valley in Switzerland, speaking French, and not know on the other side they speak German, because you haven't got the energy to get out of that valley and get over the pass. And again, that's what depression is. Depression is being stuck in a mode of thinking from which you can't escape. Now, we don't scan our patients during the psychedelic trip, because that would be probably counter-therapeutic. But we do scan our healthy volunteers, so we know that you flatten the energy landscape of the brain profoundly during the trip. That's what a trip is. But we've scanned our patients in one day and now 3 weeks after, and we see there's a persistent flattening of the landscape as this reduced modularity, more flexible thinking, is ability to escape. When your thoughts start to drop down into that depression, you can get out of it more easily. Have I got time for just a few more slides? Okay, so I want to talk about a couple of issues relevant to this in terms of the current discourse on what's critical in terms of therapeutic value of psychedelics. So one of them is the question of the experience. I mean, there are people who've said to me, well, we don't believe any of this. We don't believe psychedelics work. You'll only prove to me that psychedelics work in depression if you give them under anesthesia. I think that's interesting. Why don't you apply that to all other treatments? And you say, well, psychedelics are different because people know they're on them. And I think, well, that's actually kind of weird. Most people know they're on them. We don't actually give any treatment in psychiatry without informed consent. But there is this weirdness that people don't want to believe. They're trying to find any excuse for not believing. And so I'm not convinced. I mean, they might work under anesthesia. I doubt it, but I don't think it's worth trying to experiment. I think it's an insult. But what we can do is we can look at this. We can analyze, for instance, the subjective experiences of people who have got the psilocybin, the depressed people who've given psilocybin. And this is from the first psilocybin trial. So these, you know about these spider plots. These are the different kinds of experiences that people have under psychedelics. They're not that different. The blue group and the red group. The red group are the ones who didn't respond very well. The blue group are those who did respond very well. So in terms of synesthesia, elemental imagery, complex imagery, disembodiment, not much different. But in terms of experience of unity, spiritual experience, blissful state, and insight, there's significantly greater experiences, or those experiences are significantly greater in those who respond. And that kind of makes sense to me as a psychiatrist, because these are measures of, or experiences of change, which are really positive, and that's kind of intuitively quite likely to be what depressed people want. In the second trial, in the escitalopram trial, again, we found similar kinds of findings. We found that here, that insight, ego dissolution, the psychedelic experience did have predictive value in terms of the outcome under psilocybin, but obviously it wasn't relevant for escitalopram. Then there's another issue which has become absolutely to the fore. There's another bizarre issue which some of you who followed the FDA hearing on MDMA will come across. The first thing the FDA said at the hearing was, well, MDMA works because people expect it to work. Really? Why would they? I've never known anyone going to any trial not expecting the treatment to work. I mean, kind of, that would be unethical. But there's such a hysteria about these drugs, and such a desire to, I think, not to get them approved. That was the introductory statement at the FDA hearing. And I sat there, I thought, it's dead. That very point is dead. But we can actually reassure people that expectation isn't a predictor of the response to psilocybin. So there you go. Oh, sorry. So this is the red bars are psilocybin, the blue bars are escitalopram. This is expectation. Yeah, people getting psilocybin expected to do better than people beforehand. We asked them, do you expect psilocybin to work? Would you expect escitalopram to work? And it turned out people expected psilocybin to do better than escitalopram. Okay? But there was absolutely no correlation at all between the expectation that psilocybin will work and whether it did. But intriguingly, there was for escitalopram. So basically, the more positive you were about escitalopram working, the more likely it was to work. But that wasn't true for psilocybin. And I think that makes kind of sense, really, because for most people, probably for everyone, because no one can predict what the next trip's going to be like. Your predictions of what might happen during a psilocybin trip are likely to be very unlikely to be realised. So I think this is very comforting that essentially the drug works even if irrespective of whether you're expecting it to work. And I just want to finish by just showing you a couple of quotes, and you heard some of these in the meditation earlier on. The first one you heard, these are what our patients said. This is data from the very first The Lancet Psychiatry paper. We're still in the process. We've got so much data from the escitalopram study, we haven't managed to do all the narratives yet. But you heard that one during your meditation session. The next one you didn't. I think my outlook has changed significantly. I'm more aware now. It's pointless to get wrapped up in this negativity. I feel as if I've seen a much clearer picture. But the important message there is not the knowing is pointless to be engaged in this negativity. Many of our patients know that anyway. What they can't do is escape from it. Whereas after psilocybin, they can. And then the connectedness to the world seems to be really a very important factor in terms of recovery, but also probably in terms of persistent well-being. Here's one statement after the session when I went outside. Everything was very bright and colourful, and it felt different. I noticed things I didn't notice usually, the leaves on the trees and the birds, small detail. So being more in tune with the value of nature. For months, I would look at the park across the road from my flat. So green, a type of green I'd never experienced before. Being among the trees was incredible, like experiencing them for the first time. So vibrant, so alive. Things look different even now, so there's a much more positive perspective on the outside world. And then also improved connectivity to the inner world. And this was one patient. I became myself at age 7 after my grandparents had died. I totally was back there, so vivid, so real. I had emotions that I would have felt at the time. Fearful, why did this happen? And the shock. But able to deal with it. I felt a sense of acceptance, of more acceptance of agony, boredom, loneliness, and also appreciation of the wonderful times, and a willingness to try to accept the negative times. And connections to the body, improved connections to the body. It helped me realize when I felt pain in my chest. I saw it visually and felt it emotionally, and I felt so much lighter, like something had been released. I think this ability to bringing together bodily sensations and mental sensations, maybe in particular, well, it's certainly not going to happen on drugs, and it probably doesn't happen on psychotherapy. I lost a lot of weight just purely because I didn't want to eat badly, and that went on for some months. I couldn't eat what I knew wasn't good for me. And then this sense of self-compassion, I had an experience of tenderness towards myself, a feeling of true compassion I never felt before. And this I think is quite likely to be one of the major reasons why people do so well, because very often they're blaming themselves for decades for being inadequate, for being failures, for putting themselves in positions of vulnerability. And I think compassion-focused therapy following psychedelics could be really maybe one of the most powerful ways of helping people. And this one I like as well. It's like ingesting your own psychotherapist. And then finally, the spiritual one. I felt the presence of God. I've always thought that he was a man because of the way I was raised, reading the Bible. But it felt like a female energy, and I think that's obviously true. How could God be a man? I mean, anything else just stupid. I was taken in a rapture and was floating in midair, completely in a state of awe and ecstasy. A very powerful message to take away. And that, of course, for many people is something they've never experienced before. And I just want to finish, this is the last slide, if you please, today. I just want to emphasize the problem with antidepressants. The fact that they blunt emotions, that can be really good if that's all you've got. In fact, if that is all you've got, then use it. But we can do better. And that's the quote I showed you before about psilocybin allowing you to cope with fear. And then the CBT, and in Britain, in the UK, basically, all therapy is CBT. It's become a state religion, and it's what you get. And if it doesn't work, you get more of it. And if it doesn't work again, you get more of it. And then it's your fault. You're useless because you can't do it. And that reinforces this terrible sense of failure. And it doesn't deal with trauma. And, this is a quote from one patient, but this
This happens every day in therapy across Britain. I had the courage to tell my therapist, my psychiatrist, I was traumatized as a child, I think, in this case. I'd never told anyone. And the psychiatrist just looked at his shoes. And that is so utterly demoralizing, because the courage to say this and then to be just rejected because no one knows what to do. And I think, psychedelics they're the only process I think we have of actually allowing people to escape from those deeply traumatized memories. So I'll stop now. I'll remind you there is a book to read if you want. I'll thank the people that have supported our work, and I'll take questions. Thank you.
One microphone. So thank you for this very inspiring talk. We have time for questions and comments. You have to speak to the microphone. That's a bit difficult now, but
I hope you put your insurance sorted out.
Hi, so you said earlier on that the 5-HT2A receptor is a lot more common in the human brain than the animal brain. And we know that when a lot of people consume psychedelics, they often have a very queasy stomach. Do you know if there's been any studies on the quantity of 5-HTT, what is it, 5-H, that thing, in the stomach?
Yeah, there are some. I think that the nausea is... Oh, you're doing it? Sorry.
Psychedelic-induced nausea is almost certainly not just 2A. It's probably 5-HT1A and 5-HT2C as well, so maybe 5-HT7. So there's an awful lot of there's 80% of all the serotonin in your body is in your gut. And most of the serotonin receptors in your brain are in your gut too. So it's almost certainly not just the 2A receptor stimulating that. I think it's other receptors, because these drugs aren't clean. They do interact with many serotonin receptors and some other receptors as well. But the psychedelic effect is definitely through the 2A receptor. We know that because if you're on a pure blocker of the 2A receptor, the drugs don't have a psychedelic effect.
Thank you, David. I'm also fascinated by 5-HT2A receptors, and I was wondering, and this theory that you presented, but we know that other animals also have, like corvids, they also have evidence of theory of mind and meta-tool use, and their brain is not, it's lissencephalic, it doesn't have the cortex, and it's organized in nuclei. So I'm curious whether there is also 5-HT2A receptors, or is it working through a different mechanism there?
I've never seen any data on consciousness-changing effects of psychedelics in crows. So the answer is I don't know. And in fact, it's a kind of a question I've asked the COVID queen in Britain, who has shown that the COVIDs have a theory of mind, or at least some crows. And I said, well, why don't you do these experiments and find out whether it is a cortex? She said, no way. There's no way we're going to inject things into our crows. No. Yes. I don't know the answer to that. And but they don't have a cortex in the same way as we do. So, I have no idea. Let someone else do that research, please.
What do you think about combining TMS, so neuromodulation therapy, and psychedelic on microdosing mostly?
Well, we're sufficiently interested in doing that we've got two postdoc fellows starting that now. But what we're starting first is not microdosing, because it's difficult to know whether that would do anything. So what we're doing, and this is not this is not a trivial experiment, as all of you will probably understand, is we're going to look to see whether we can, so we're going to give people DMT, and then in the sort of, a couple of hours later, well, I say we're going to do this, the ethics haven't approved it yet, but we think it is ethical. We'll see what you think. So we're going to give people a DMT trip, and then 2 hours later, when we think the neuroplasticity will still be there, we're going to do TMS or other transcutaneous kind of interference tasks, which we know in animals can produce neuroplasticity. So watch this space. Do you think that's ethical? I mean, I think it's ethical if they give informed consent again. And actually, we got a lot of people wanting DMT, so.
Just a question about like the double blinding of those studies, because that seems to be a very important point for the FDA approval. Do you think that the method you showed with the correlation between like expectation, like treatment expectation and actual outcome is kind of an alternative, or what do you think are good alternatives? Because this double blinding point seems to be really backbreaking for the whole endeavor. And because we can't do it, but they seem to insist on it. So do you think that might be some alternative, or do you have alternatives for that?
Yeah, I think the FDA are really stupid, and they I think there's almost no systematic study of blinding in any medicine. I spoke to the EMA about this after the FDA decision, and I said, tell me a study where they've blinded oncology treatments. And they said, we don't think there is one. But that's a real illness. And the fact that they're throwing up all the time, well, that doesn't mean that they're going to want to get better. I mean, it's a double standard, and my own view is we should ignore it. And frankly, I don't actually care whether the FDA approve a medicine, because I know these drugs are medicines, and we all know that. And the way Australia is going about it is the way to go forward. I find it quite offensive that we are not allowed to call something a medicine until an American drug company is selling it to. I mean, come on. So the answer is, we have to persuade our regulators to look at things differently, and I think that's why I showed you the Bayesian analysis. That's why I think we should be doing much more sophisticated N-of-1 trials before, after, which we know will work in disorders like epilepsy. There's no reason why they won't work in disorders like depression, and we should be getting rid of this false prejudice against these drugs. But the Americans, I think they're going to have to do something cleverer. They're going to, and one of the things they can do is to look at expectation beforehand, and that would go some way towards it. You can't blind it, and so why pretend? And the other argument, I say, show me a study of knee replacement that's been blinded. Oh, I don't do that, because that's real science, and yeah, that's real. Surgery isn't blinded, but we don't care. We only care about this just because they're psychedelics. If they were causing a lot of pain, no one would care. But they're not. People are terrified that people are having fun, and that's bad. And then they're really struggling, but this is a serious issue, the challenging experiences. But then, of course, we get caught on that hook, and people say, oh, they're really dangerous then. But they're not, they're powerful drugs. The other analogy I use, and you might like this, there's psychotherapists in the room, aren't there? Show me a blinded study of exposure therapy for spider phobia.
Do it under anesthetic.
Let me just make two small comments. The first, esketamine was approved by the FDA and by the EMA, and still esketamine, all the time, all those years when esketamine was tested, there was always the debate about functional unblinding, and still it was approved finally.
Exactly.
Yeah.
That's double standards, but that's a proper drug.
Right. But let me also play the devil's advocate at this point, because you showed your study against escitalopram. We wrote actually a letter to your study to the New England Journal, in which we showed, or we believe we have shown, that the response in the escitalopram group is smaller than in a usual placebo-controlled trial, escitalopram against placebo. Actually, the escitalopram, in terms of Hamilton, decrease in Hamilton scores was smaller than with placebo in a usual trial. So there is a point in functional unblinding and expectation, because the patients in your escitalopram trial, they wanted to get the psilocybin and not escitalopram. So they are disappointed if they actually know they have the usual SSRI. If I want to get escitalopram, I go to my GP and not to a clinical trial.
Yeah, no, it's a very good point, and it's a testimony to our skills at equipoise that so many people stayed in the trial on escitalopram, isn't it? Because they believed it, they wanted to know the result. That's the first thing to say. I was going to make another point. You get the opposite, though. You know, there are people who go in and who don't get better, and this happened in the Compass trial. I mean, one of the most chilling conversations I had, so some of you will know that Compass Pathways completed a very beautiful study. It was 3 doses, a 1 milligram, a 10 milligram, a 25 milligram dose of psilocybin, single dose I think they did it in several hundred people in, how many? 327 people, done I think in 6 or 7 different countries. The high dose, the 25 milligram dose, the output was almost identical to what we had, almost identical, and the lower doses didn't work. So when that was published in the New England Journal, I got a usual phone call or email from CNN saying, what do you think about the suicide scores in this? I said, what? Well, look, there were a couple of people who had increased suicidality. And this truly tells you the problem. All their newspapers wanted was to find some reason to create a scare about psilocybin. In fact, what was happening was there were a couple of people in the high dose who had a high dose, but they didn't stay well. So that's the nocebo effect. And you know, that's in some ways more of an issue for the work than maybe a reduced placebo, a reduced response in the escitalopram group. Because if people over-expect and don't get it, then they can be very... And in fact, that's actually, just as an aside, that's one of the reasons why the MDMA FDA hearing was problematic, because there was one person in that panel had a bad response to MDMA and has campaigned viciously, maybe not viciously, but vocally, I better be careful what I say, to try to stop it happening, because she suffered and she thinks that that's a reason for not having a medicine.
At first, thank you very much for your speech. I just have one question. You talked about like spiritual experiences that patients had during these trials. Is there any way of knowing what is happening in the brain when patients have those experiences of unity, for example, of feeling like at one with the universe? Like what is happening in the brain when people have these deep spiritual experiences?
Well, one of our team, Chris Timmermans, has been looking at that. He's been looking at that for 6 years under DMT. You know, I set him a task. Will you find the entities, please? And he hasn't found them yet. That's pathetic, isn't it? I mean, come on, how long is he going to take? The answer is we don't know. What we do know is that there is an interesting, a strong parallelity between DMT and near-death experiences. So whether that's got something to do with reduced brain blood flow in some circuits or other, I don't know, but I'm just throwing that out. That's all that's it, the best I can do to answer that. There's presumably a circuit that's got in which those are encoded, but we don't know where it is yet. And then it may be rather broader than we think, because I showed you the default, it's likely default mode is involved, and that's quite broad. So the answer is it may be difficult to answer your question, sorry.
Thank you. Do you know, or what are your thoughts about, is there a future for psychedelics and people with psychotic tendencies, schizophrenia or psychotic depression?
I doubt it. It's conceivable that maybe some very fixed delusional systems might be perturbable by psychedelics, right? But I'm actually scared of those experiments being done, because I feel that we're on quite a knife edge at present. I gave you the example of CNN. I think there's not a lot of public criticism of psychedelics, but that doesn't mean that there's not a lot of hostility under the surface. And I think it would only take one or two really bad examples of people having severely traumatic psychotic reactions. And that's most likely in people who've got prior psychosis. So I'm very, very scared of that. What I'm beginning to see, there's a bit of interest in using sub-psychedelic, or low doses, maybe not a microdose, but a mini dose, possibly for sort of neuro protection, maybe for trying to improve cognition a bit, maybe. And that's one of the areas where the psychedelic people are really pushing. They believe they can improve cognition through psychedelics without having psychedelic. And they may be right, but I'm scared of giving people with psychosis a full trip, because history tells us there are some people that did that and they're still psychotic.
I have two questions. One question is regarding patients who have taken conventional antidepressants before the psilocybin. Have they been off the medication? And if not, is that an influence on the subjective experience? Maybe I leave it, or maybe I add the second question shortly. Yeah, otherwise it's a back and forth. The second question is, to what extent the psychedelic experience is necessary to alleviate depression? I've been wondering this for a while, since there's preclinical studies showing that blocking the 5-HT2A receptor still induces plasticity in the brain and reduces depression-like behavior, and that implies that maybe the psychedelic experience is not as necessary, and the neurobiological underpinnings are more playing a role. And I would like to hear your opinion on that.
So the first question, what do you do with people who are on SSRIs? And the answer is, we don't know. I mean, we do know from population studies of individuals going to retreats, etc., that being on SSRIs definitely attenuates the experience. And that was why in our first study we tried to get people off. But getting people off SSRIs is not trivial, especially if they're severely depressed. Because many of them say, well, the SSRIs don't work, but you discover when they come off, they were working and depression gets worse. So that's quite challenging. So in the second trial, we kept some on, well, no, in the second trial, the escitalopram trial, we actually had some who weren't on and some who were on. We got off, and there were different outcomes in those two groups. So in the ones who'd never been on SSRIs, psilocybin was clearly better, significantly better than escitalopram. But the ones who'd come off SSRIs, they were the same. Now that could be because what escitalopram was doing was essentially dealing with an SSRI withdrawal state, which also occurs. Now, what other groups have done, and the Mind Medicine group with LSD, they've given bigger doses of LSD to overcome any possible blockade by the SSRI and they've got effects of LSD in people on SSRIs. And they say that's a preferred approach because the one negative predictor of outcome in our trials is anxiety during the trip. And they say that being on SSRIs reduces that anxiety because SSRIs are anxiolytic. So that might be a way of actually, you might get as good, if not better outcomes. So it's very much an open question at present. If you're a preclinical researcher, are you? Yeah. But if you can research this, then this is a really important topic to research because it's not been properly researched at the level of receptor interactions and the downstream plasticity. But that gets me onto your second question. Do you need a psychedelic experience to get better? Well, my own view is that it's likely that a psychedelic experience, as I've shown you, is going to be therapeutic. And I think the neuroplasticity, which inevitably comes from having psychedelics, fits very well with the person using and getting benefit from the psychedelic experience, particularly the insights and developing new ways of thinking. So I see the two of them as being almost certainly very helpful together. But then this whole industry of the non-psychedelic psychedelic and the neuroplastogen leading to improving depression, that's a completely different story. I find it almost inconceivable that a non-psychedelic dose of something that's going to cause neuroplasticity will overnight lift your depression. Now, I mean, if I'm wrong, well, that's great news. But my suspicion is that those neuroplastogens, if they work at all, and we have no idea if they do, will end up being like SSRIs. You'll have to keep taking them for a period. And again, neuroplasticity by itself in someone who's depressed, what's that mean? I mean, what actually does that mean? And people say, oh, it's great, because your brain's kind of doing better. Yeah, but if you're ruminating all the time, maybe you'll ruminate more. I mean, I like to point out, cocaine has got really powerful neuroplasticity ability, but it ain't a good antidepressant.
I would like to add that Igor Branki, for example, has shown that plasticity is not necessarily a good thing. If you just continue with your bad environment, then plasticity actually leads to worsening of depression. I think Mark was first.
Just a quick question because of the question of the 5H2A receptors and SSRIs. So I was wondering, because when you take them for a long time, it's known that the 1A receptor gets down-regulated, I think. So I was just wondering if the same happens with the 2A receptor as well. And then, for example, that someone is on SSRI, so it's actually, let's say, contraindicated to be on an SSRI for a long time and then taking psilocybin for antidepressant treatment, or it's not making it as good as it could be.
It's not making it as good. I think that's the answer, isn't it? Yeah, that is not making it as good. I think and there is a kind of degree of internalization of the 2A receptor in after people have been on SSRIs a long time. But it is slightly more complicated than that, but I'm too tired to go into it with you.
Okay, that means we have to stop soon.
Well, you carry on talking amongst yourselves. But
you've been showing your position on the non-psychedelic psychedelics. There's another discussion going on that is on psychedelic psychotherapy versus just psychedelic or the psychological support surrounding those substances. Could you please give us your opinion on that too?
So psychedelic support is a term which is used to avoid confronting the reality of what happens during a psychedelic trip. it's a way of kind of appease. It's hoped, I think, that it will appease regulators like the FDA. There's obviously there's support around the trip, and then all is good. And that's not that may be a good way forward. It may be that will allow the anxiety of the FDA to be assuaged. But I think it's really important, and that's why I show, even though many of you know how this is done, psychological support isn't just about sitting there and making sure they don't jump out the window. It's about preparing people, and it's about being present, and it's about, I think, debriefing. And it seems weird, it seems very unlikely to me that would not be I think it's vital for safety, and it's likely to be beneficial. So the question then is, what do you do afterwards? And that is a really important question. We know that our patients want to do lots more afterwards, and I think they have the right to, well, that's what they want, they should get it. If we can afford it, they can afford it. We don't obviously know what, if any, different forms of therapy are more useful afterwards. It's hardly been studied. But we are faced with this challenge, of how to fit psychedelics into the modern medical model. And one approach we're taking, you might find interesting. So we're going to be doing currently we've only got 2 psilocybin studies being teed up. And they're both in addictions. One is in gambling disorder, and one is in heroin addiction. And in the gambling disorder study, we're taking people who are already in therapy, and we're bringing them in for their trip with their therapist, the current therapist paid for by the NHS. And that therapist will be a sitter through the experience, the three days, alongside one of our therapists. And we're hoping that way that the therapy will continue afterwards. And to my mind, that's I think it's really clever, because it's a before and after experiment. They're in therapy, they're not doing very well. They have a psychedelic, the therapist sees them having a psychedelic and carries on doing the therapy. And if maybe it'll work after the trip. So that might end up being the way forward, so that people come out, people who will be in therapy, as most of them will, and then come in for a psychedelic experience with their own therapist and a psychedelic experience therapist. So that could be a way of sort of getting through this impasse.
We come to an end very soon, so maybe just 2 more questions. Max, Wolf.
So you mentioned the spider exposure example, and I was wondering, so thinking of spider exposure therapy for arachnophobia, would you say that's spider-assisted psychotherapy, or is it spider with psychological support?
Yeah, obviously, the point I was making was that the blinding is I don't think anyone's ever properly blinded someone from exposure therapy, but no one cares. It's just that we are obsessed, and this is an artifact of people not understanding science, and that's why we wrote the paper into British Clinical Pharmacology. Most people, even people who don't have no idea what an RCT is, think that RTCs are the gold standard. And Michael Rawlins, who was head of the MHRA, the head of NICE, and the head of the Advisory Council of the Misuse of Drugs, had the 3 most senior positions in British pharmacology, he gave a lecture called the Harveyan Lecture in 2008 to the Royal College of Physicians. It's written up as a little book, it's available on the web, and he argues very sensibly, I think, that the RCT is not the apex. The RCT is just one way of gathering data. but it's the most expensive way of gathering data. And because the people who are going to RCTs are so peculiarly selected because they can't have any comorbidity, RCTs are almost irrelevant to real medicine because there's no such other people outside the RCTs. So everyone should read this. Now, in a few weeks' time, there's a paper coming out in Lancet Psychiatry that is an essay that I've written, and it's a very long essay. It's about 10,000 words, so you just settle down with a good cup of tea when you read it. But in that essay, it's called 50 Years of Failure, Why We Have Made Almost No Progress in Psychiatric Drug Treatment in the Last 50 Years. And in that, I argue, I introduce his concepts and the reference to the lectures in there. So I argue that we have to reframe our view. The regulators have become so utterly complacent. They have basically done what pharma has told them to do. In fact, regulators won't assess data that isn't produced by big pharma because they don't know how to, because most regulators don't actually understand anything other than the sort of last 30 years of getting RCT data. They say they're going to change. The MHRA have said for 6 years they're going to look at real-world evidence. 2014, the FDA said they've got a program on real-world evidence. I cannot find a single example from FDA, EMA, MHRA, where they've used it or even given an example of how they would use it. So it's just weasel words. So the answer is we've got to change the way we look at data. And you'll be pleased to know there's a large section in this essay on how we've got to make psychedelics more easy to study, and we've got to change the regulations, and we've got to look at novel ways like N-of-1 trials to do that.
I'm sorry, I think that was a perfect final word. Very good, very inspiring. Thank you again for this great talk and for the great discussion and for your insights. Thank you very much.